Climate change. I saw you posting a link to a study suggesting that a lot of the way that it's talked about has been overhyped. What are your beliefs about climate change?
Well, I spent a lot of time. I don't really have beliefs about climate change. I wouldn't say. I mean, I think the climate is probably warming, but it's been warming since the last ice age. So I don't know.
But it's
exactly
dramatically accelerated even in the last couple of decades.
Maybe. Mm-hmm. And possibly. It's not so obvious. I spent quite a bit of time going through the relevant literature. I read about 200 books on ecological, what would you call it, on ecology and economy when I worked for the UN for about a 2-year period, and it's not so obvious what's happening, just like with any complex system. The problem I have fundamentally isn't really a climate change issue. It's that I find it very difficult to distinguish valid environmental claims from environmental claims that are made as a, what would you call it, secondary anti-capitalist front, essentially. So it's so politicized that it's very difficult to parse out the data from the politicization.
So I saw there was a line in 12 Rules which says people stricken with poverty don't care about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And I think that's not an unreasonable point to make, because you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? People, if you can't eat, then actually you can't really worry about what's happening in 50 years to the planet. However, I don't think that's a reason not to tackle climate change, because those same people in the global south...
It's partly a reason.
Is it though? Because people in the global south...
coal-generated plants stop people from starving. So yes, it's partly a reason. And it's certainly the case that making energy more expensive, obviously, makes things more difficult for poor people. So yes, it's definitely an issue. And I would say, it's kind of a conundrum for those on the left. It's like, what's it going to be? Clean air or hungry people? Think, well, we don't have to choose. It's like, okay.
Or renewable energy, or...
Oh, good luck with that.
Or nuclear power. I'd be fine with more nuclear power stations.
Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we're moving in that direction very fast.
No, but that is a solution.
Well, it worked for the French.
I was fascinated. David Attenborough is something kind of close to a national religion in Britain. So there's a bit where you say population control advocates like him, you compare them to Eric Harris, one of the Columbine killers. Why then is it virtuous to propose that the planet might be better off if there were fewer people on it? And I found that completely boggling, that you have elided their population control through people not being born and the mass slaughter of people who are already alive.
It's the motivation that I question.
Right, tell me more about that.
Well, what kind of statement is the planet would be better off with fewer people on it? First of all, there's an easy solution to that. You could leave.
Unfortunately, much the best efforts of Elon Musk, that is not yet an option permanently.
No, that isn't suicide? What I mean. That's what I meant, yes. If you're very concerned about your carbon footprint, there's a very fast solution to that. So, and I think it's disingenuous to, well, it's the other people, or maybe it's the people who haven't been born yet. It's like, this is also the problem I have with much of the environmentalist movement, is there's a powerful stream of anti-human sentiment that motivates it, and masquerading under the guise of virtue on a planetary scale. It's like, could be. I mean, it's not like we're not fouling our own nest, But
that's why I'm fascinated by where you come from, is because the book, is so much about things being in balance and harmony, right? And order and chaos outweigh each other. Well, what overpopulation has done is got to the same point.
Who says we have overpopulation?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to see under the current model of fossil fuel-based capitalism. Sorry to use that word. I know it upsets you.
But that is what you
when we run out of fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Well, it will happen.
Yeah.
Because there is
people have been saying that's going to happen for 50 years, and now the United States is a net exporter of fossil fuel.
Right.
And so no one saw that coming, did they? But it happened.
And you're right, that might be the case, but at the moment I would say that China is putting up new coal-fired power stations by the bucket load. Yeah. It is entirely possible that the stuff that the developed nations did, that now developing nations did, and now doing to make themselves richer.
They'll get concerned about clean air when they get richer. That's what the data indicate. Once you get GDP up to about $5,000 per year, people start to become concerned with environmental issues. So if we make people rich fast enough, I don't think so. It'll happen too late for some things. It looks like we're going to top out at about 9 billion. I think we can handle that. I think probably one of the problems that'll beset us in 100 years, assuming there are even creatures like us around in 100 years, is that there'll be too few people, not too many. The projections top out at about 9 billion. It's only 2 billion more than we have now. There's every reason to assume that we can cope with that. especially given the rapid decreases in poverty around the world at the moment. There's a bit of a bottleneck. There'll probably be some more extinction. What we're doing to the oceans by overfishing doesn't seem very smart, but we've only been aware of our role as planetary stewards since 1960, I would say, and we're not doing too bad for people who just woke up to the fact that we're actually a planetary force. And I don't think that we're overpopulated. I think all the arguments that all the people who made those arguments in the 1960s, like Paul Ehrlich, I think he wrote The Population Bomb, predicted mass starvation by the year 2000. He was absolutely and completely wrong.
No, we've been very lucky with things like golden rice, for example, and genetic engineering of crops. I think that's...
Yeah, it's not luck.
No, it is. I agree. Human ingenuity is a huge part of that, definitely.
Right. Well, and more people, more ingenuity. And Bjorn Lomborg, who I really admire, this skeptical environmentalist who's actually gone a very long ways to trying to figure out what we could do at a planetary level that would actually be useful and productive. His research has indicated the best possible investment isn't carbon tax, it isn't cessation of utilization of carbon-based fuel. It's probably investment in early infant care around the world, especially in developing countries. Seems right to me. He's done the analysis very carefully.
Microphone. So there's a hand right there at the back that went up very, very quickly there.
Drought, flooding, and ocean acidification, unanticipated for 65 million years, all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that will unite us that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics, and second, even if the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it, and so no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. It was like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, Good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize. But they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents. And if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents. But if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, you know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, you know? It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, you know? And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, you know, being concerned about global warming. It's like, you know, one of the reasons there's more trees in the northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do, burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop, like, having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like, you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So, no.
Thank you for that.